broadly shared, to say the least. So I will leave you with that. And with this, I am very excited to open the conference with the next panel, Toward a New Economy. Welcome, all of you, come on out. Jeanna Smialek of the New York Times will be moderating a discussion between Sarah Bloom Raskin of Duke University, Dania Francis of UMass Boston, and myself on the causes and consequences of economic inequality and policy solutions to tackle it. And with that, I hand it over to you, Jeanna. You are in charge.
Awesome.
I hope you do it. Yes. Sure. Thank you.
Well, so I guess we are starting a panel on a big week for the U.S. economy. You know, GDP report, Fed meeting, jobs report this morning. So good job picking a nice quiet week for economy watchers to get started. But I think this is a really exciting panel because we're going to be talking about the new economy. And I think amid that sort of steady drumbeat of economic news, it's a cool time to kind of take a step back and think about what all of this means and what sort of the big broad trends are happening under the surface. And it could not be a better panel to do that with. So we have Dania Francis from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she is an assistant professor of economics. She is a board member of the National Economics Association and a National Academies of Education postdoctoral fellow. Her research interests include examining racial and socioeconomic disparities in education, wealth accumulation, and labor markets, and the criminal justice system. We've also got Sarah Bloom Raskin, who is at Duke University, among other affiliations. And she is there working to improve the public's understanding of markets and regulation. She previously served as Deputy Secretary of the US Treasury, becoming the highest ranking woman in the history of the department. And prior to her confirmation, Raskin served as the governor of the Federal Reserve Board, or a governor of the Federal Reserve Board, a commissioner of financial regulation for the state of Maryland, and as banking counsel for the US Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. You already know about Heather Boushey, so I will not reintroduce you. But sort of without further ado, I just want to jump into questions. And Heather, I'd like to start with you. So obviously you have a new book out. And a big theme in that is about how inequality subverts institutions and can kind of erode public trust in those institutions. And I was hoping you could just kind of expound on that, just to get us started. Why do you think these trends are so worrying for how governance is done here in Washington?
Thank you, and thank you so much for moderating this discussion. I think that it's a great place to start with trust. I was actually in a conversation with some colleagues yesterday, and we were talking about this issue of the intersection between how we think about the economy, how people experience the economy nationwide, and what that means for how people have trust or confidence in government. And, we know from the data that we've spent, just if you look over the long brush since 1980, we've seen, year over year, not every year, but, over that trend, that time period, you've seen declines in the kinds of public investments that people want government to make in education. We haven't seen government take up the investments that people want to make in early childhood and in other aspects of people's lives, healthcare. And we've seen this decline in who's in the role that the wealthy are in paying taxes and the way people perceive that. And when you put those two together, what you see from the research evidence, and in our first round of grantees, we funded this scholar named Vanessa Williamson, who's now at Brookings. And she was a graduate student at the time and did work on, and released this fantastic book on how people feel about paying taxes. And what she found in both qualitative and quantitative work is that people are more than happy to pay taxes for things that they feel benefit them. But if you have this move here at the federal level to say we need to cut taxes, and then on the other hand, you're cutting the things that people actually value, you're setting up this really terrible dynamic where people aren't getting what they need, and you're not setting up the resources that you need, and most importantly, people don't feel that it's fair. So I would start there, but I do think, I feel like I'm often sort of tag teaming between these two places, both on the concentration of income and wealth on the one hand and the role of government. But I think that the trust issues today are also it's important to think about the ways that trust also feeds into how people perceive the government playing a role in making sure that the market is working and that the market itself is fair. So, economists and people who work in government will talk about antitrust, and I think many of us don't. That's a hard word to wrap your hand around because it sounds bad, like you don't trust something, like you're against trusting. But what that really means is the set of rules around how it is that we ensure that there's fair and open competition. And I think that that is a place, too, where people don't have a lot of confidence that the government is acting on their behalf and that they, in their community, are going to benefit. So I don't have any quick hit answers for this. I feel like, as I said in my opening, I feel like if we can change the conversation about what growth is, maybe that'll get us to a place where we can start talking about how we can ensure that what policymakers are doing here in Washington and state houses around the country actually benefit people. But we have to start moving towards that. And the first step is recognizing that we have a problem, I think.
Right, absolutely. And I think that idea sort of leads really nicely into Dania's research here, because you have a really interesting way of looking at inequality in the sense that you look at fairness and access to opportunity, really, at the end of the day. And so I guess I'm curious how you see sort of these trends that Heather is talking about playing out in a way that sort of obstructs opportunities for growth, especially among racial minorities, among women. How are these trends playing out in your research?
Absolutely. And first I want to say thank you as well. I'm really excited to be here today. So you're right. I tend to think of things from sort of a micro perspective going upwards. And one of the things that I think of when I think about how do we grow our economy is we invest in our people. Right? We invest in human capital. How do we invest in human capital? Well, we feed people, we house them, right? We make sure they're healthy, and we educate them. And an unfortunate thing in this country in the past and currently is that we have these gaps in the opportunity to invest in your own human capital, right? And so some of that arises from historic circumstances that I really like how Heather brought up wealth concentration, right? So when I think about wealth concentration, I also think about racial wealth gaps and why is wealth important for human capital investment? Because it provides access, it provides opportunity. With wealth, I'm able to buy my way into a neighborhood with fewer pollutants and better schools. And without access to that, right, I have to sort of, take what's given to me, right? And wealth is also protective. Right? So it's protective against adverse life events. It affords you opportunities to do things like be an entrepreneur. If I want to be an entrepreneur, I have to be willing to fail and able to fail. And if I have more wealth, I am able to fail, right? As opposed to if I have nothing to fall back on, right? So there are all these things that wealth provides that help us grow our own human potential, right? That large segments of the population don't have access to. Right? So racial minorities, especially blacks and Hispanics in the country, women of all races, members of the LGBTQ community, and especially I think those who lie within the intersection of some of those communities, right? Can have some sort of particularly devastating consequences from discrimination in this society. Right? So I will sort of wrap this up and put a button on it by saying that there are, and we can maybe hopefully talk about some of the causes of this racial wealth gap, but it's there, it persists, it's intergenerational, and it perpetuates itself, right? Wealth can beget wealth, and I think that without addressing that, we are in danger of continuing to lose those innovators that Heather mentioned earlier, right? The lost Einsteins, right? So who are we missing by undervaluing and underinvesting in certain children.
Right, absolutely. And I guess, that is a very interesting microeconomic view of this, that, the details really matter here. I guess pulling back and looking at the macro picture, which Sarah, obviously you did as a Fed governor very, very often and well. I'm curious, how do these trends play into what we're seeing in broader growth? How does this potentially distort the kind of consumption that we're looking for in the economy?
Great. So let's talk about distortions. And I do want to add my thanks. I've got to say I am just a huge fan of equitable growth. You guys are asking the right questions at the right time in the right way, and hats off to this terrific work and this conference. So on the distortion side, here's really how I look at this. So what inequality is doing is it's distorting the economy by both introducing fragility and masking it. Okay, so first, how is this fragility introduced? Okay, as kind of the traditional way of looking at this is, essentially by saying that it's gutting sustainable consumption. Okay, so consumption being the engine of economic